The champagne glass hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, sending golden liquid across my sister's designer heels. Madison didn't even flinch. She just stared at me with that familiar look of disgust, the same expression she'd worn since we were kids, whenever I dared to exist in her perfect world. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "Clean it up, Jessica," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of cruelty that comes naturally to people who've never had to work for anything. "Oh wait, I forgot. That's literally your job, isn't it? You're just a janitor." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Around us, the charity gala continued its elegant dance of wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, where Chicago's elite had gathered to raise money for childhood cancer research. I was wearing my best dress, a simple black number I'd found at a thrift store and altered myself, trying to blend in at an event I'd only been invited to because Madison needed a +1 and couldn't find anyone else willing to endure her company for 3 hours. My name is Jessica Chen, and that moment, standing in a puddle of spilled champagne while my sister's laughter echoed off the vaulted ceiling, was the night everything changed. Not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't know, what none of them knew. Kabul. You know what the funniest part is? Madison continued, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Her voice carried that particular pitch it always reached when she was performing cruelty for an audience. "Our parents spent a fortune on your education, and you ended up pushing a mop around St. Margaret's Hospital. Meanwhile, I'm closing million-dollar real estate deals before lunch." Dr. Elizabeth Whitman, seated at the table behind us, shifted uncomfortably. I caught her eye for just a moment, saw something that might have been recognition flickering across her face before she looked away. She was the head of pediatric surgery at St. Margaret's, though Madison didn't know that. Madison didn't know a lot of things. I knelt down and began picking up the larger pieces of glass, my hands steady despite the tremor of rage building in my chest. This wasn't the first time Madison had humiliated me in public, and it wouldn't be the last. But as I gathered the sharp fragments, I thought about the other hands that had been busy that day. The same hands that had just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency room. The hands that had sutured a 7-year-old's forehead after a playground accident. The hands that had successfully intubated a car crash victim when the attending physician couldn't get the airway. The hands of someone who is 3 months away from finishing her medical residency. "You missed a spot," Madison said, pointing to a small shard near her foot. "Though I guess attention to detail was never your strong suit. Remember when you used to say you wanted to be a doctor?" She threw her head back and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Thank God you figured out your limitations before you hurt someone." I stood up slowly, the broken glass cupped in my palm. For a moment, I considered telling her. I imagined the look on her face when she learned that her janitor sister had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern's medical school, that she was currently completing her emergency medicine residency at the very hospital where she cleaned floors during the day. I pictured her expression when she discovered that the limitation she was so fond of mocking was actually a carefully constructed cover story, a way to pay for medical school without asking our parents for help, a method of staying invisible while I built something extraordinary. But I said nothing. Because Madison had always been the golden child, the one who got everything handed to her on a silver platter. She'd inherited our father's real estate empire, complete with clients, connections, and a trust fund that made her monthly income more than most people earned in a year. She lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, drove a BMW that cost more than my annual tuition, and wore jewelry worth more than my entire wardrobe. What she didn't inherit was work ethic, humility, or the ability to see beyond her own reflection. I walked to the nearest trash can and disposed of the glass, then returned to the table where Madison was already regaling our dinner companions with another story about my failures. She was telling them about the time I'd worked at a veterinary clinic in high school, how I'd come home covered in dog hair and smelling like disinfectant, how embarrassing it had been for her to explain to her friends why her sister was playing in the dirt with animals. She didn't mention that I'd spent those summers learning about anatomy and physiology, that I'd stayed late to watch surgeries, that the veterinarian had written one of my medical school recommendation letters. She didn't know because she'd never asked. Madison had never asked me about anything that mattered. The worst part, she continued, gesturing dramatically with her newly filled champagne glass, is that she acts like she's better than everyone else. Like pushing a mop is some kind of noble calling. It's honestly sad. Noble calling. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Every day for the past 3 years, I've worked 2 jobs. During the day, I cleaned floors, emptied trash cans, and sanitized surfaces at St. Margaret's Hospital. It was honest work, and it paid well enough to cover my living expenses while I attended medical school at night. But more importantly, it gave me access to the hospital environment, let me observe procedures, learn from doctors, and understand the ecosystem I was fighting to join. During my cleaning rounds, I'd overhear conversations about complex cases, witness life and death decisions, see the exhaustion and dedication of the medical staff. I learned the hospital's rhythms, its politics, its unspoken rules. I memorized the names of every doctor, nurse, and administrator. I studied how they moved through crisis, how they communicated under pressure, how they balanced compassion with clinical necessity. What Madison saw as limitation, I had turned into opportunity. What she dismissed as failure, I had transformed into a foundation. The head of the hospital's board of directors, Dr. Margaret Santos, approached our table. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes, someone who commanded respect without demanding it. Madison immediately shifted into her networking mode, the artificial smile and calculated charm she used when she smelled opportunity. Dr. Santos, Madison gushed, extending her hand. Madison Chen, Chen Properties. I believe we've met before at the Harbor Club. Dr. Santos shook her hand politely, but briefly, her attention already moving past Madison to survey the room. Her eyes landed on me for a moment, and I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition? Curiosity? I couldn't be sure. Lovely event, Dr. Santos said diplomatically. The funds raised tonight will make a real difference in our pediatric cancer research program. Oh, absolutely, Madison agreed, though I knew she had no idea what specific research the money would support. It's so important to give back to the community. This is my sister Jessica. She works at St. Margaret's too. The way she said works made it sound like a euphemism for something embarrassing. Dr. Santos turned to me with genuine interest. Oh, what department? Before I could answer, Madison jumped in. She's in sanitation services. Very dedicated to keeping things clean. The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Dr. Santos studied me more carefully now, and I saw the exact moment when recognition clicked into place. Her eyebrows rose slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to know that she knew exactly who I was. She'd seen me in the emergency department, had probably heard about the intubation I'd performed when Dr. Rodriguez couldn't get the airway. She might have even read the case notes I'd submitted about the experimental treatment protocol I'd researched for a particularly difficult patient. Sanitation services, Dr. Santos repeated slowly, her voice carefully neutral. How? Interesting. Madison missed the subtext entirely, too busy basking in what she perceived as her own superiority. Jessica's always been more of a hands-on person, she said with false sweetness. Not everyone is cut out for the intellectual demands of medicine. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Santos looked between Madison and me, her expression unreadable. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she processed the dynamics at play. She was a woman who had fought her own battles to reach the top of her profession, who understood what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked. Intelligence, Dr. Santos said finally, comes in many forms. Some people are naturally gifted at recognizing it, and others. She let the sentence hang unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Madison's smile faltered slightly, confused by the apparent criticism. She was used to being the smartest person in the room, at least in her own mind, and Dr. Santos's comment didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed about herself. Well, Madison said, recovering quickly, I should introduce you to some of the other donors. There are several prominent families here tonight who might be interested in expanding their philanthropic involvement. Dr. Santos nodded politely. I'm sure there are. If you'll excuse me, I should make my rounds. She paused, looking directly at me. Jessica, isn't it? Perhaps we'll have a chance to chat later this evening." As Dr. Santos walked away, Madison turned to me with narrowed eyes. "What was that about?" I shrugged, the picture of innocence. "I have no idea. Maybe she's just being polite." But I knew exactly what it was about. Dr. Santos had recognized me not as the janitor Madison saw, but as Dr. Jessica Chen, the resident who had caught her attention with my quick thinking and clinical instincts. She'd probably heard about my research proposal on emergency triage protocols, or seen the commendation letter from the pediatric department after I'd helped calm a scared child during a difficult procedure. The evening continued with Madison networking aggressively, dropping names and laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. She introduced me to various people as my sister, the janitor, always with that particular emphasis that made it clear she considered it a mark of shame. Each introduction felt like a small knife wound, not because I was ashamed of honest work, but because of the malicious joy she took in my supposed failure. What she didn't see were the subtle nods of recognition from hospital staff and attendants, the quick glances of respect from nurses and technicians who knew me as the resident who always stayed late to help, who never complained about difficult cases, who treated everyone from patients to cleaning staff with equal dignity. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. As the evening wound down, Madison's cruelty reached new heights. She'd had too much champagne and too much attention, a combination that always brought out her worst instincts. "You know what I don't understand," she said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, "is why you even came tonight. I mean, what did you think would happen? That somehow being around all these successful people would magically transform you into something more than you are." The words hit harder than she probably intended, not because they were true, but because they revealed so much about how she saw me. To Madison, I would always be less than, someone whose only purpose was to make her feel better about herself by comparison. I looked around the ballroom at the glittering crowd, at the wealthy donors and distinguished doctors, at the people Madison so desperately wanted to impress. In a few months, when I completed my residency, I would be one of them. I would wear the white coat with pride, carry the responsibility of life and death decisions, hold the title that she thought was forever beyond my reach. But tonight, I was still just Jessica the janitor in Madison's eyes. Tonight, I was still invisible. 3 years earlier, I'd made a decision that would change everything, though nobody in my family understood it at the time. While Madison was celebrating her promotion to senior partner at Chen Properties with a weekend in Napa Valley, I was filling out an employment application for a custodial position at St. Margaret's Hospital. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was toasting her inherited success with champagne that cost more than my weekly paycheck while I was about to embark on the hardest journey of my life. The decision hadn't been born from desperation, but from strategy. Medical school at Northwestern cost $65,000 a year. And despite my academic achievements, my parents had made their position crystal clear during a tense family dinner the previous spring. "Medicine is too competitive," my father had said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Madison's proven herself in real estate. The family business needs continuity, not risky ventures." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes never leaving her plate. "Besides, Jessica, you're not like Madison. She has the personality for networking, for building relationships with clients. You're more introspective." Introspective. Their polite way of saying I wasn't charming enough, aggressive enough, superficial enough to succeed in their world. What they couldn't see was that the very qualities they dismissed as weaknesses were exactly what would make me a good doctor. My ability to listen, to observe, to think before speaking. My tendency to put others' needs before my own. My willingness to work quietly in the background while others took credit. "If you want to pursue medicine," my father had continued, "you'll do it on your own. Madison needs our support to expand the business. We can't spread our resources thin on uncertain outcomes." Madison had smirked across the table, twirling her engagement ring around her finger. She'd been dating Trevor Martindale, heir to a construction fortune, and their combined family wealth was already being discussed in terms of empire building. "Besides," she'd added, "didn't you barely pass organic chemistry? Maybe Dad's right about this being too competitive for you. I had barely passed organic chemistry. I'd earned an A-, and only because I'd missed the final review session to work a double shift at the veterinary clinic where I was saving money for application fees. But correcting Madison would have required explanation, and explanation would have led to argument, and argument would have changed nothing. So I'd simply nodded and asked to be excused from the table. That night, I sat in my tiny studio apartment near campus, surrounded by medical school brochures and financial aid forms, and made a plan. If my family wouldn't support my dreams, I'd find another way. I'd already been accepted to Northwestern's medical program on academic merit alone, but accepting meant finding a way to pay for it myself. The custodial job at St. Margaret's was perfect, for several reasons. First, it paid better than most entry-level positions, because hospitals needed reliable, trustworthy employees who could handle biohazardous materials and maintain strict sanitation protocols. Second, it offered health insurance and tuition assistance programs for employees pursuing healthcare-related degrees. Third, and most importantly, it would put me inside the medical world I desperately wanted to join. On my first day on the job, I'd reported to Maria Gonzalez, the head of environmental services. She was a woman in her 50s who'd worked at St. Margaret's for over 20 years, starting as a cleaner and working her way up to department supervisor. She had intelligent eyes and calloused hands, and she looked at me with the kind of skepticism reserved for college graduates who thought they were too good for honest work. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked, handing me a uniform and a badge. "Most people with your education don't last 6 months. They think they're above mopping floors and emptying bedpans." I'd looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not most people." She'd studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." The work was harder than I'd expected, but not in the ways people assume. Physically, it was demanding. I'd wake up at 4:30 a.m. to start my shift at 5 o'clock, working until 2 p.m. cleaning patient rooms, operating theaters and administrative offices. My hands became raw from chemicals, my back ached from constant bending and lifting, and my feet swelled from hours of standing on concrete floors. But the real challenge was invisible. It was the way people looked through me, as if the uniform made me part of the hospital's infrastructure rather than a person. Doctors would discuss sensitive cases in front of me as if I weren't there. Nurses would hand me contaminated linens without a word of thanks. Patients' families would brush past me in hallways as if I were a piece of furniture that had wandered into their path. What they didn't know was that I was absorbing everything. Every medical term, every procedure, every protocol. I learned the hospital's geography better than some staff members who'd worked there for years. I knew which doctors were brilliant and which were dangerous, which nurses went above and beyond for their patients, and which ones were just collecting paychecks. Dr. Rachel Kim became my unwitting mentor during those early months. She was a second-year resident in emergency medicine, Korean American like myself, though she'd grown up in privilege while I'd fought for every opportunity. She was brilliant, dedicated, and completely unaware that the woman cleaning her workspace was memorizing her every movement. I'd watch her handle trauma cases through the glass partition of the ER, studying how she prioritized tasks during mass casualty events, how she communicated with frightened patients, how she maintained composure when everything around her was chaotic. She had a particular way of explaining complex medical concepts in simple terms, a gift for making scared families feel heard and understood. One evening, while cleaning the residents' break room, I overheard her on the phone with what sounded like her mother. She was speaking in Korean, but her frustration was universal. When she hung up, she'd noticed me emptying the trash and had actually made eye contact. "Long day?" she'd asked, which was more conversation than most staff members ever attempted. "They all are," I'd replied, which had made her smile. "Tell me about it. Sometimes I wonder if I'm crazy for choosing this life. The hours, the stress, the constant pressure to be perfect." She'd paused, studying my face. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's expectations instead of your own dreams?" The question had hit closer to home than she could have known. "Every day," I'd answered honestly. She nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Rachel, by the way. I don't think we've been properly introduced." "Jessica." Well, Jessica, thanks for keeping this place functioning. I know it's thankless work, but it matters more than people realize. That brief exchange had sustained me through months of invisibility. Not because of the recognition, but because it reminded me that empathy was learnable, that good doctors weren't born understanding people's struggles, but developed that understanding through experience and observation. Meanwhile, my family remained oblivious to my double life. To them, I was Jessica the failure, the daughter who'd disappointed them by choosing janitorial work over joining the family business. Madison, in particular, took perverse pleasure in my apparent downfall. "I saw Jessica at the grocery store yesterday," she'd told our parents during one of their weekly dinners that I'd stopped attending. She looked exhausted. I felt kind of bad for her, wearing that ugly uniform, smelling like bleach. But I guess everyone has to find their level eventually. She'd shared this story with cruel satisfaction at a family barbecue the following weekend, not knowing that I'd just completed my first semester of medical school with a 3.9 GPA, not knowing that the ugly uniform represented something she could never understand: the willingness to sacrifice pride for purpose, comfort for growth, approval for authenticity. My schedule was punishing. 5 days a week, I'd finish my hospital shift at 2 p.m., grab a quick lunch, and head straight to Northwestern for afternoon and evening classes. I'd study in the hospital's 24-hour cafeteria until midnight, surrounded by medical textbooks and the quiet hum of night shift workers. On weekends, I'd work extra shifts to cover my living expenses and save money for textbooks and lab fees. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion, though that was constant. It wasn't even the financial stress, though there were weeks when I lived on ramen noodles and hope. The hardest part was the isolation, the inability to share my struggles and victories with the people who should have mattered most. When I aced my anatomy and physiology exams, I celebrated alone in my apartment with Chinese takeout and a rented movie. When I struggled with pharmacology, I found study groups among my classmates, brilliant young men and women whose parents were doctors and lawyers and engineers. People who spoke of their children's achievements with pride and offered support when needed. Dr. Amanda Foster, my biochemistry professor, had noticed my unusual schedule during my second semester. She'd asked me to stay after class one evening, curiosity evident in her expression. "Jessica, I have to ask. Your performance in this class is exceptional, but I've noticed you're often rushed, sometimes eating dinner during lectures. Are you working while attending medical school?" I'd hesitated, unsure whether honesty would help or hurt me. "Yes, ma'am. Full-time at St. Margaret's Hospital." Her eyebrows had risen. "Doing what?" "Environmental services." She'd been quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Then she'd smiled, not with pity, but with respect. "That's remarkable. Do you mind if I ask why?" "Because I want to be a doctor more than I want to be comfortable," I'd answered. She nodded slowly. "That kind of determination is rare. If you ever need a reference or recommendation, I'd be honored to provide one." That conversation had marked a turning point. Dr. Foster had become an advocate, connecting me with scholarship opportunities and research positions that paid small stipends. She'd introduced me to other faculty members who appreciated students with real-world experience, who understood that my perspective as someone who'd worked alongside hospital staff would make me a better physician. But at home, I remained invisible. Madison's real estate career continued to flourish, fed by family connections and inherited client lists. She'd bought a condo overlooking the Chicago River, furnished it with pieces that cost more than my annual salary, and threw parties for her society friends who spoke in hushed tones about their latest acquisitions and investments. During my third semester, she'd invited me to one of these gatherings, probably out of obligation rather than desire for my company. I'd arrived after my hospital shift, still tired and wearing simple clothes that stood out starkly among the designer ensembles of her guests. "This is my sister Jessica," she'd introduced me to a group of her friends. "She's finding herself right now." The conversation had moved quickly past me to discuss vacation homes and wine collections, topics that might as well have been foreign languages. I'd stood in the corner, observing these people who'd never known real struggle, who measured worth in material possessions and social connections. What they couldn't see was that while they discussed their trivial concerns, I was saving lives. The previous week, I'd assisted during a code blue when the regular staff was overwhelmed with a multi-car accident. I'd performed chest compressions while Dr. Kim prepared for intubation, my movements precise and confident because I'd been studying emergency protocols for months. The patient had survived. A father of 3 who'd gone home to his family because I'd been in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge. That victory was worth more than all of Madison's real estate commissions combined. But it was a triumph I couldn't share without revealing the secret that protected my dual existence. By my final year of medical school, the physical toll was showing. I'd lost weight, developed chronic dark circles under my eyes, and earned a reputation among hospital staff as someone who never called in sick, never complained, and always stayed late when needed. What they interpreted as dedication to janitorial work was actually commitment to learning everything I could about hospital operations before I transitioned from cleaner to physician. Dr. Santos, the hospital board director, had begun noticing me during this period. She'd see me in the emergency department during my off hours, sometimes helping to translate for Spanish-speaking patients, sometimes simply observing procedures with the intensity of someone studying for an exam. One evening, she'd approached me directly. "Jessica, isn't it? I've seen you around the hospital quite a bit. Are you interested in medicine?" The question had caught me off guard. "Yes, ma'am. Have you considered pursuing formal education in healthcare?" I smiled at the irony. "I'm actually finishing medical school at Northwestern. I'll be applying for residency programs soon." Her expression had shifted from polite interest to genuine surprise. "You're in medical school? While working full-time here?" "Yes, ma'am. It's been challenging." She'd studied me with new eyes, seeing not the janitor in scrubs but the future doctor who'd been hiding in plain sight. "That's extraordinary. What specialty are you considering?" "Emergency medicine. I want to be where I can help the most people, especially those who don't have advocates." She nodded thoughtfully. "We should talk more about this. I'd like to hear about your experiences, your perspective on healthcare delivery from a unique vantage point." That conversation had led to others, informal mentoring sessions, where Dr. Santos had shared insights about hospital administration, healthcare policy, and the challenges facing modern medicine. She'd seen value in my unusual background, understood that my years of working alongside support staff had given me perspectives that traditional medical students lacked. But at home, I remained with the family. Madison's engagement to Trevor had been announced with a lavish party at the country club, complete with champagne toasts and newspaper announcements. She'd been featured in society magazines as one of Chicago's most eligible young women, her success story told in terms of beauty, breeding, and business acumen. Meanwhile, I'd been studying for my Step 2 clinical knowledge exam in the hospital's basement break room, surrounded by the industrial laundry machines and chemical storage units that had become my second home. The contrast between her celebration and my solitude had been stark, but it no longer stung the way it once had. I'd found something Madison would never understand: purpose beyond recognition, satisfaction beyond material success, and self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval. In 3 months, I would graduate from medical school and begin my residency in emergency medicine at St. Margaret's Hospital, the same institution where I'd spent years being invisible. The girl who cleaned floors would become the doctor who saved lives, and the family who'd dismissed her would finally see what they'd been too blind to recognize. But the journey to that moment would test everything I'd learned about myself, everything I believed about justice and forgiveness, and everything I'd sacrificed to become the person I was meant to be. The morning after the charity gala, I made a decision that had been building for months. As I stood in my small apartment, still wearing the black dress from the night before, I realized that the humiliation Madison had inflicted wasn't just cruelty, it was liberation. For the first time in 3 years, I could see clearly what I needed to do. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I'd been avoiding: Dr. Patricia Reeves, the residency program director at St. Margaret's Hospital. 3 weeks earlier, she'd made me an offer that seemed too good to be true. After observing my work during clinical rotations and hearing recommendations from faculty members, she'd suggested I could transition immediately into my residency role while finishing my final semester requirements. "Your performance during the emergency department rotation was exceptional," she'd told me during our meeting in her sterile office overlooking the hospital's main entrance. "We've had our eye on you for some time. Your unique perspective, combined with your clinical skills, Makes you exactly the kind of resident we want in our program. At the time, I hesitated. Starting my residency early would mean revealing my double life to everyone, including my family. It would mean stepping out of the shadows where I'd been safely invisible and into the harsh light of expectation and scrutiny. I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of exposure. But Madison's laughter from the night before still echoed in my ears. "You're just a janitor." The words had crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate. I was tired of hiding. Tired of letting other people's limited vision define my reality. Tired of protecting a family that had never protected me. I drafted a text message to Dr. Reeves. "I've reconsidered your offer. When can we meet to discuss the transition timeline?" Her response came within minutes. "My office. Monday morning at 7 a.m. Congratulations, Dr. Chen." Dr. Chen. The title sent a thrill through me that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. For 3 years, I'd been Jessica the janitor, Jessica the disappointment, Jessica the family embarrassment. But Dr. Reeves saw something different. She saw Dr. Jessica Chen, emergency medicine resident, future physician, someone whose opinion would matter and whose decisions would save lives. That weekend, I began the process of disentangling myself from my old life. I submitted my formal resignation to Maria Gonzalez, effective in 2 weeks. She'd looked at the letter with confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been pride. "You're moving up," she'd said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I knew there was something different about you from day one. Most people in this job are running from something. You were running towards something. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for proving that good people still exist." She'd paused, studying my face. "The other staff members are going to miss you. You treated everyone with respect, from the CEO to the newest hires. That's rare." The conversation had been more emotional than I'd expected. Maria and her team had been my colleagues for 3 years, the people who'd seen me at my most exhausted and vulnerable, who'd covered for me when medical school demands conflicted with work schedules. They'd never known about my dual life, but they'd supported me anyway, with small kindnesses and professional courtesy that my own family had never shown. My next stop was Northwestern Medical School's financial aid office. With my residency salary, I could finally pay off my student loans on a reasonable timeline instead of the decades-long payment plan I'd been dreading. The financial counselor, Ms. Jennifer Walsh, had looked at my file with amazement. "You've been working full-time while completing your medical degree?" she'd asked, scrolling through screens of employment records and academic transcripts. "Yes, ma'am." "And maintaining a 3.8 GPA?" "Yes, ma'am." She'd leaned back in her chair, shaking her head in disbelief. "In 30 years of doing this job, I've never seen anything like this. Most students struggle to maintain passing grades while working part-time. How did you manage it?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. How do you explain that desperation can be a powerful motivator? That when you have no safety net, you learn to fly or you fall? That when your family writes you off as a failure, you become determined to prove them wrong, even if they never see the proof? "I wanted it more than I wanted to sleep," I'd said finally. Ms. Walsh had printed out my loan paperwork and handed it to me with something approaching reverence. "Dr. Chen, what you've accomplished is extraordinary. I hope you know that." Dr. Chen again. Each time someone used the title, it felt more real, more legitimate. For 3 years, I'd been living in the future tense, always working towards something that seemed impossibly distant. Now, suddenly, the future was becoming the present. The hardest part of the transition wasn't professional, it was personal. How do you tell your family that everything they believe about you is wrong? How do you reveal that their disappointment has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding? How do you explain that you've been living a double life not out of deception but out of necessity? I decided to start small. The following Tuesday, I called my mother and asked if we could have lunch. Just the two of us, somewhere neutral. She'd agreed, though I could hear the confusion in her voice. We rarely spoke one-on-one, and when we did, it was usually because she needed something. We met at a small cafe near her office, a place where she often entertained clients. She'd arrived wearing one of her power suits, the kind of outfit that announced success and demanded respect. I'd come straight from the hospital, still in scrubs from my final shifts in environmental services. "You look tired," she'd said by way of greeting, her eyes scanning my appearance with familiar disapproval. "I've been working hard." "Madison mentioned you made quite an impression at the charity gala," she'd continued, settling into her chair with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "She said you seemed out of place. Out of place." The phrase stung because it was both true and false. I had been out of place at the gala, but not for the reasons Madison assumed. I'd been out of place because I was pretending to be someone I wasn't. The failed daughter, the family disappointment, the woman who'd settled for less than her potential. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." She'd looked up from her menu with polite attention, the kind of expression she wore when indulging a child's trivial concerns. "I'm graduating from medical school in 6 weeks." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. For a moment, she'd simply stared at me, her brain apparently unable to process the information. Then her expression had shifted through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something that might have been anger. "What are you talking about?" "I've been attending Northwestern Medical School for the past 4 years. I'm completing my degree and starting my residency in emergency medicine at St. Margaret's Hospital." "That's impossible." Her voice was flat, definitive. "You work as a janitor." "I worked as a janitor to pay for medical school. It's how I supported myself when the family decided not to help with my education." The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the cafe continued its normal rhythm of clinking dishes and quiet conversation, but at our table, the world had stopped. My mother's carefully composed facade began to crack, revealing something raw underneath. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Tell you what? That I was pursuing the career you said was too competitive for me? That I was proving wrong every assumption you'd made about my limitations? That I was succeeding without your help or approval? We could have supported you." "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended. "You made your choice. You chose to invest in Madison's inherited business instead of my earned potential. You chose to see my determination as stubbornness and my independence as failure." Her hands had begun to shake slightly, the first physical sign that my revelation was affecting her. "Jessica, if we had known—" "You didn't want to know. When I brought home straight A's from college, you told me grades weren't everything. When I got into medical school, you said it was a waste of time. When I took the hospital job, you acted like it was confirmation of your worst fears about my potential." The conversation had continued for another hour, but nothing productive came from it. My mother had alternated between defensive justifications and half-hearted apologies, never quite able to acknowledge the full scope of what she'd missed. She'd been so invested in her narrative about my limitations that accepting my success would mean admitting her own failures as a parent. I'd left that lunch feeling empty rather than vindicated. I'd expected some form of satisfaction from revealing the truth, some moment of recognition or regret. Instead, I'd encountered the same emotional distance that had characterized our relationship for years. The only difference was that now she knew the distance had been justified. My father's reaction, when my mother inevitably told him, was even more predictable. He'd called me that evening, his voice carrying the forced joviality he used when trying to smooth over family tensions. "Jessica, your mother tells me you have some big news." His tone suggested he was treating my medical degree like a hobby I'd finally decided to mention, rather than a life-changing achievement I'd earned through years of sacrifice. "It's not news, Dad. It's reality. I'm a doctor." "Well, that's wonderful. You know, we always knew you were smart. Maybe when you're finished with this residency thing, you could consider joining the family business. We could use someone with your analytical skills." The suggestion was so tone-deaf that I'd actually laughed out loud. 4 years of medical school, years of preparation for a career saving lives, and he was still trying to funnel me into real estate. Some things never changed. "I won't be joining the family business, Dad. I have my own career now." Of course. But you know, medicine is a tough field. Long hours, high stress. The family business is stable, secure. Madison's doing very well." And there it was. Even when confronted with my success, he couldn't resist comparing me to Madison. Even when forced to acknowledge my achievements, he had to qualify them with suggestions for how I could be more like his golden daughter. The final conversation was with Madison herself. She'd ambushed me outside my apartment building 3 days after my lunch with our mother, her face flushed with what I initially mistook for embarrassment but quickly recognized as fury. "You could have told me," she'd said without preamble. "You let me humiliate myself at the gala, talking about your limitations to the head of the hospital board. Do you have any idea how that makes me look?" Even then, faced with the revelation that everything she'd believed about me was wrong, her primary concern was her own image. Not my accomplishments, not the challenges I'd overcome, not the years of struggle she'd witnessed and dismissed. Her reputation was the only thing that mattered. "I didn't let you do anything, Madison. You chose to be cruel. You chose to mock someone you thought couldn't defend themselves. The fact that you were wrong about my circumstances doesn't change the fact that you were wrong about everything else." She'd stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between respect and resentment. For the first time in our lives, she was looking at me as an equal rather than someone to be pitied or dismissed. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what? Becoming a doctor? Since I was 12 years old. Planning to do it without family support? Since you all made it clear that wasn't an option. You're making us look like terrible people. I'm not making you look like anything. I'm just living my life according to my own values instead of your expectations." That conversation had ended with Madison storming off, her heels clicking angrily against the sidewalk as she disappeared around the corner. I'd watched her go with a mixture of sadness and relief. For 3 years, I'd protected our family's feelings by hiding my true self. Now that the truth was out, their discomfort was no longer my responsibility. The following Monday, I'd walked into Dr. Reeves's office wearing scrubs for the last time as an environmental services employee. By the end of that meeting, I'd received my new hospital ID badge, complete with the title that changed everything. Dr. Jessica Chen, emergency medicine resident. The transformation was both subtle and profound. The same hallways I'd walked as a janitor looked different when viewed through the eyes of a physician. The same people who had ignored me for 3 years now nodded respectfully when they saw my white coat. The same rooms I'd cleaned were now spaces where I would make life and death decisions. But the most significant change was internal. For the first time in years, I was living as my authentic self, no longer hiding my intelligence behind a mop bucket or my ambitions behind a uniform. The weight of pretense had lifted, replaced by the heavy responsibility of medical practice. But it was a burden I'd chosen rather than one imposed by others' limitations. 3 years of quiet preparation had led to this moment of quiet triumph. No fanfare, no celebration, no family pride, just the simple satisfaction of becoming who I was meant to be. The girl they'd dismissed as a janitor was gone, replaced by Dr. Jessica Chen, and there was no going back. The news of my transition from janitor to doctor spread through St. Margaret's Hospital like wildfire, but not in the way I'd expected. Within 24 hours of my first official shift as a resident, everyone from security guards to senior physicians knew the story. The woman they'd seen mopping floors for 3 years was now saving lives in the emergency department. Dr. Kim had been the first to put the pieces together. She'd walked into the residence lounge that Tuesday morning and stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me sitting at the conference table in my white coat, reviewing patient charts. "Jessica?" Her voice carried a note of disbelief. "You're the new resident Dr. Reeves mentioned?" "Yes, ma'am." She'd stared at me for a long moment, her mind clearly racing through years of brief interactions. "You've been working here as environmental services while attending medical school?" "Northwestern. Just graduated." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Dr. Kim was remembering every conversation we'd had, every assumption she'd made, every time she'd spoken about complex medical cases in front of me without realizing I was absorbing every word. "My God," she'd whispered finally. "You've been studying us, learning from us. We never knew." Word spread quickly after that. By noon, a cluster of nurses had gathered around the charge station, whispering excitedly about the revelation. By evening shift change, the story had reached the administrative offices. By the end of the week, it was hospital legend. But the reaction wasn't universal admiration. Some staff members felt deceived, as if my hidden identity had been a betrayal of their trust. Others were embarrassed, remembering conversations they'd had or comments they'd made in front of someone they'd assumed was just the cleaning lady. Dr. Marcus Webb, a senior emergency physician with a reputation for arrogance, had cornered me in the supply closet during my second day. "So you've been playing some kind of game," he'd said, his tone accusatory. "Pretending to be something you weren't, listening to privileged information, observing our methods under false pretenses." "I was never pretending," I'd replied calmly. "I was working to pay for my education while gaining experience in a hospital environment. Nothing I did was deceptive or unethical. You should have disclosed your student status." "To whom?" "My supervisor knew I was pursuing healthcare education. The hospital's tuition assistance program was designed for employees in my exact situation. I followed all policies and procedures." He'd glared at me with the kind of resentment reserved for people who challenge established hierarchies. Dr. Webb was someone who believed in rigid social structures, who was comfortable with the idea that janitors stayed janitors and doctors were born into their roles. My existence contradicted his worldview, but for every Dr. Webb, there were 5 Maria Gonzalezes, people who saw my journey as inspiration rather than deception. The environmental services staff had thrown an impromptu celebration in the basement break room, complete with a cake from the hospital cafeteria and a card signed by everyone in the department. "You showed them," Carlos, one of the night shift cleaners, had said with genuine pride. "You showed them that we're not invisible, that we have brains and dreams and potential." The housekeeping staff's reaction had been particularly meaningful because they understood the daily humiliations I'd endured. They'd seen how some medical staff treated support personnel, the casual dismissiveness, the assumption that anyone in a uniform was somehow intellectually inferior. My success was validation for all of them. Tama 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 tam. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, my family was struggling to process the new reality. The carefully constructed narrative they'd built about my life was crumbling, and the debris was damaging relationships that had already been strained. My mother had started telling people about my medical degree, but her delivery betrayed her discomfort with the situation. She'd cornered Mrs. Patricia Holbrook, our next-door neighbor, in the grocery store 3 days after learning the truth. "Did you know Jessica is a doctor now?" she'd announced, her voice carrying forced enthusiasm. Mrs. Holbrook, who'd watched me grow up and had always been kind to me, had smiled warmly. "How wonderful! She was always such a bright, determined child. You must be so proud." "Oh, we are. We always knew she was destined for great things. The hospital job was just temporary, a stepping stone, you know." The revisionist history had begun immediately. Suddenly, my parents were claiming they'd always supported my medical ambitions, that the janitorial work had been part of some grand family strategy rather than the result of their refusal to help. They were rewriting the past to protect their image, but the people who knew our family saw through the pretense. Madison's response was more complex. She'd always defined herself in contrast to my supposed failures, building her self-esteem on the foundation of my apparent limitations. With that foundation suddenly removed, she was forced to examine her own accomplishments without the comfortable backdrop of my struggle. She'd called me 2 weeks into my residency, her voice tight with emotion I couldn't quite identify. "People are talking," she'd said without preamble. "About what?" "About you. About us. About how we treated you." There was a pause, filled with the sound of her breathing. "Trevor's parents asked about my doctor sister at dinner last night. They wanted to know why I'd never mentioned you were in medical school." Trevor Martindale's family represented the kind of old-money Chicago elite that Madison desperately wanted to impress. They were the type of people who valued genuine achievement over inherited wealth, who respected education and professional accomplishment. Learning that Madison had a doctor in the family elevated their opinion of her, but it also raised questions about why she'd kept it secret. "What did you tell them?" I said. "I said it was complicated, that you'd wanted to do it on your own, without family help." Even when forced to acknowledge my success, she couldn't admit the truth, that the family hadn't offered help, that they'd actively discouraged my ambitions. She was protecting the narrative that portrayed our parents as generous benefactors, rather than the obstacles they'd actually been. "Madison, why are you calling me?" "Because I need to understand. Why didn't you fight back? All those times I criticized you, mocked you, treated you like you were beneath me. You could have shut me down with one sentence. You could have told me you were in medical school, that you were working towards something incredible. Why didn't you defend yourself? The question revealed more about Madison than she probably intended. She was struggling with the realization that she'd been cruel to someone who hadn't deserved it, someone who'd been accomplishing things she could barely imagine while enduring her contempt with grace. Because defending myself to you would have required your approval to matter to me, I'd answered honestly. And I'd already learned that your opinion wasn't based on reality. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Madison was beginning to understand that her cruelty hadn't wounded me the way she'd intended because I'd stopped valuing her judgment years ago. The power she'd thought she held over me had been largely imaginary. But the most dramatic unraveling was happening with our parents' social circle. Chicago's professional community was smaller than people realized, and news traveled quickly through networks of country clubs, charity boards, and business associations. Dr. Santos had mentioned my transition during a board meeting at the Chicago Medical Society, praising the hospital's role in supporting non-traditional medical students. Word had spread from there to various philanthropic organizations, many of which included my parents' friends and business associates. Within a month, my mother was fielding awkward questions at her book club, garden society meetings, and charity luncheons. People who'd known our family for years were asking why they'd never heard about Jessica the medical student, only Jessica the janitor. The implication was clear. Either my parents had been ashamed of their daughter's ambitions, or they'd been too disconnected from my life to know about them. Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael, the wife of one of my father's business partners, had confronted my mother directly at a fundraising gala for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. "Margaret, I had lunch with Patricia Santos last week. She told me the most remarkable story about a young woman who worked as a janitor while completing medical school." Imagine my surprise when she mentioned the name Chen. My mother had apparently fumbled through an explanation that satisfied no one, least of all herself. The carefully maintained image of family harmony and success was cracking under the weight of reality. My father's reaction was more business-focused but equally problematic. He'd built his real estate empire on relationships and reputation, and having a doctor-daughter was actually an asset in his social circles. But the story of how that daughter had achieved her success without family support was damaging his image as a patriarch and mentor. He'd called me during my third week of residency, his voice carrying the forced joviality that meant he wanted something. "Jessica, how's the doctor business treating you?" "It's going well, Dad." "Wonderful, wonderful. Listen, I've been thinking. Now that you're established in your career, maybe we should discuss some opportunities. I'm developing a medical office complex on the North Shore, and I could use some professional input on the design and layout." Even then, he was trying to find a way to monetize my achievements, to turn my success into his advantage. The conversation had continued with him, outlining various ways I could contribute to family business ventures, all while maintaining the pretense that he'd always been supportive of my career. "Dad, I appreciate the offer, but I'm focused on my residency right now. I don't have time for outside projects." Of course. But down the road, when you're ready to think about private practice, family connections could be very valuable." He still didn't understand. He thought my medical degree was a stepping stone to something more profitable, more aligned with family interests. The idea that I might find fulfillment in emergency medicine, that I might choose helping people over maximizing income, was foreign to his worldview. Meanwhile, at the hospital, I was discovering the challenges of transitioning from observer to participant. For 3 years, I'd watched medical dramas unfold from the sidelines. Now I was in the center of them, making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. My first major case had come during my second week. A construction worker had fallen from scaffolding, arriving with multiple trauma injuries that required immediate intervention. I'd been the first resident on scene, and for a moment, the weight of responsibility had been overwhelming. But my years of observation paid off. I'd seen similar cases handled dozens of times, had studied the protocols, understood the priorities. My hands were steady as I established IV access, my voice was calm as I communicated with the trauma team, my decisions were quick and accurate. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the attending physician overseeing the case, had watched me work with growing amazement. "Where did you do your clinical rotations?" she'd asked afterward. "Here mostly, but I've been observing procedures in this hospital for 3 years. As a medical student? As an environmental services employee?" Her expression had shifted from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe. "You learned emergency medicine by watching while you cleaned?" "Among other things." "That's incredible. I've never seen a first-year resident with that level of situational awareness and procedural knowledge." The compliment had meant more than she could have known. For 3 years, I'd wondered if my unconventional preparation would translate into clinical competence. Dr. Mitchell's validation confirmed that my sacrifice had been worthwhile, that the knowledge I'd gained through observation and study was as valuable as traditional training. But success in the hospital couldn't fill the emotional void left by my family's dysfunction. Their inability to acknowledge my achievements without trying to claim credit or find advantage revealed fundamental flaws in our relationships that couldn't be fixed by professional accomplishment. The final straw came during my 4th week of residency. Madison had organized a dinner party for Trevor's birthday, inviting his family and several prominent couples from their social circle. She'd called to invite me, her voice carrying artificial sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "You should come," she'd said. Trevor's parents specifically asked about meeting my doctor sister. The phrase doctor sister revealed everything. I wasn't Jessica anymore. I was a credential she could display, a trophy that elevated her own status. She wanted to parade me in front of people whose approval she craved, using my achievements to enhance her image. "I'll be working that night." "Can't you switch shifts?" "This is important, Jessica. Trevor's father is considering a major real estate investment, and having a doctor at the table would really impress him." Even my medical career was being viewed through the lens of how it could benefit the family business. My years of struggle, my hard-won expertise, my commitment to helping people, all of it reduced to a marketing tool for Madison's social climbing. "I'm not a prop for your dinner parties, Madison. That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is. You spent years telling me I was worthless, and now that I've proven my value, you want to use me to impress people you're trying to manipulate. I won't be part of that." The conversation had ended with Madison's frustrated protests, but I'd made my position clear. They'd had their chance to be part of my journey when it mattered. Now that I'd reached my destination, they couldn't simply claim seats on the victory tour. The girl they'd dismissed was gone, replaced by someone who understood her worth and wouldn't compromise it for family approval. The unraveling of their comfortable assumptions was just beginning, and the consequences would reshape everything they thought they knew about success, value, and the true meaning of family. 6 months into my residency, something extraordinary happened that changed not just my career trajectory, but the entire landscape of how people viewed my journey. It started with a case that should have been routine, but became the catalyst for everything that followed. It was a Tuesday evening in October when the ambulances started arriving in rapid succession. A multi-vehicle accident on the Dan Ryan Expressway had created a mass casualty situation, and St. Margaret's was the designated Level 1 trauma center receiving the most critical patients. As the newest resident, I was expected to assist the senior physicians, but what unfolded that night would establish my reputation in ways I could never have anticipated. The first ambulance brought in a family of 4 whose sedan had been crushed between 2 semi-trucks. The parents were conscious but badly injured, while their 2 children, ages 6 and 8, were in critical condition. The second ambulance carried the driver of one of the trucks, a man in his 50s, who was going into cardiac arrest as they wheeled him through the doors. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the senior attending, began barking orders as trauma teams assembled around each gurney. But within minutes it became clear that we were overwhelmed. 2 more ambulances were incoming, and our available physicians were already stretched beyond capacity. "Chen," Dr. Rodriguez called out to me, "take the truck driver, stabilize him, and prep for surgery." It was the kind of responsibility that first-year residents rarely received, especially in such high-stakes situations. But as I approached the patient, everything I'd learned during my years of observation clicked into place. I could see the signs of massive internal bleeding, recognize the specific pattern of injuries consistent with steering wheel impact, understand the cascading physiological failures that were threatening his life. My hands moved with confidence I didn't know I possessed. I established multiple IV lines, ordered the appropriate blood work and imaging, coordinated with the surgical team, and performed an emergency thoracostomy when his lung collapsed. Throughout the procedure, I was aware of other medical staff watching, but I remained focused on the patient whose life hung in the balance. What I didn't know was that Dr. Santos, the hospital board director, had arrived to oversee the mass casualty response. She'd been observing from the administrative area when she noticed something unusual. A first-year resident running a trauma resuscitation with the skill and composure of someone with years of experience. "Who is that?" she'd asked Dr. Reeves, who had also arrived to help manage the crisis. "Dr. Jessica Chen. She's the former environmental services employee I told you about." Dr. Santos had watched with growing amazement as I successfully stabilized the truck driver and coordinated his transfer to surgery. What she was witnessing contradicted everything she thought she knew about medical training and experience acquisition. The truck driver survived. More importantly, so did all 6 patients from that evening's mass casualty event, an outcome that was far from guaranteed, given the severity of their injuries. In the aftermath, as we cleaned up the trauma bays and debriefed the cases, Dr. Rodriguez pulled me aside. "Where did you learn to handle pressure like that?" she'd asked, genuine curiosity evident in her voice. "I've been watching trauma cases for 3 years," I replied. "I've seen every possible scenario, studied every protocol. When it was my turn to act, I knew what needed to be done." "That's not normal, Chen. Most residents freeze up in their first major trauma. You performed like you'd been doing this for years." Her observation was accurate, but she couldn't understand the full context. While other medical students had learned from textbooks and limited clinical rotations, I'd received an education that no classroom could provide. I'd watched hundreds of cases, seen every type of emergency, observed how different physicians approached complex problems. My unconventional preparation had given me advantages that traditional training couldn't match. Word of my performance spread quickly through the hospital's medical community. Within days, I was being invited to observe surgeries, asked to assist with complex procedures, and consulted on challenging cases. Senior physicians who had barely acknowledged my existence as a janitor were now seeking my input as a colleague. Dr. Michael Harrison, the chief of emergency medicine, called me into his office the following week. He was a man in his early 60s who had built his reputation on developing innovative trauma protocols and mentoring exceptional residents. "Dr. Chen, I've been hearing remarkable things about your clinical performance. Dr. Rodriguez tells me you handled last week's mass casualty event with unusual skill." "Thank you, sir. I'm curious about your background. Your file indicates you completed medical school while working full-time as a hospital employee. That's an extraordinary achievement." "Yes, sir." He'd leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for complex medical problems. "I have a proposition for you. We're developing a new emergency medicine fellowship program focused on mass casualty response and disaster medicine. It's designed for physicians with exceptional clinical instincts and leadership potential. I'd like you to consider applying." The offer was stunning. Fellowship programs were highly competitive, typically reserved for residents who had completed their full training and demonstrated exceptional ability. Being invited to apply as a first-year resident was virtually unprecedented. "Sir, I'm honored, but I've only been a resident for 6 months." "Dr. Chen, in 30 years of emergency medicine, I've learned to recognize potential when I see it. Your unconventional background has given you perspectives and skills that traditional training can't provide. We need physicians who can think outside established protocols, who can adapt to unexpected situations, who can lead under pressure. You've already demonstrated all of those qualities." The fellowship program Dr. Harrison described was unlike anything I'd imagined possible. It would involve training with federal disaster response teams, working with international humanitarian organizations, developing protocols for large-scale emergency situations. It was the kind of opportunity that could reshape not just my career, but my ability to impact healthcare on a national and international level. But accepting would mean accelerating my timeline, moving faster than anyone expected, including myself. It would also mean additional scrutiny, more visibility, and higher stakes if I failed to meet expectations. "Can I have some time to consider the offer?" "Of course. But don't take too long." The program starts in January, and there are other candidates being considered. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by medical journals and case studies, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months earlier, I'd been cleaning hospital floors while secretly dreaming of becoming a doctor. Now I was being invited to join an elite fellowship program that could position me as a leader in emergency medicine. Marco. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family had been struggling to explain my transformation to their social circles, I was quietly building something they couldn't comprehend. They saw my medical degree as a vindication of delayed potential, but the reality was far more complex. I wasn't just becoming the doctor they'd never expected. I was becoming the kind of doctor that other physicians aspired to be. My decision was made easier by a conversation with Dr. Kim, who had become an unexpected mentor since learning about my background. She'd invited me for coffee at a small cafe near the hospital, one of the few times I'd socialized with colleagues outside of work. "You're going to accept Harrison's offer," she'd said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "How do you know?" "Because you're not someone who settles for conventional paths. You spent 3 years creating your own route to medicine. Now you have a chance to create your own route within medicine." She was right, of course. The traditional residency track would have been safe, predictable, and ultimately limiting. Dr. Harrison's fellowship program represented something different, an opportunity to shape the future of emergency medicine while developing expertise that few physicians possessed. What if I'm not ready? What if I fail? Dr. Kim had smiled at that, the kind of expression reserved for questions that answer themselves. "Jessica, you've been ready for this since the day you decided to pursue medicine while mopping floors. The only question is whether you're willing to let other people see what you're capable of." 2 days later, I walked into Dr. Harrison's office and accepted his offer. The paperwork was completed within a week, and suddenly I was Jessica Chen, emergency medicine fellow-elect, scheduled to begin advanced training in disaster medicine and mass casualty response. The news spread through the hospital with the same rapid intensity that had marked my initial transition from janitor to resident. But this time, the reaction was different. Instead of surprise or skepticism, there was respect, even awe. I was no longer the cleaning lady who'd shocked everyone by becoming a doctor. I was the doctor who was redefining what was possible in emergency medicine. Dr. Webb, who had initially questioned my integrity, approached me in the hallway 3 weeks after my fellowship acceptance was announced. "Dr. Chen, I owe you an apology," he'd said, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching humility. "When I first learned about your background, I questioned your methods. I've since realized that your approach was not only ethical but extraordinarily effective. What you've accomplished is remarkable." The apology meant more than he probably realized. Dr. Webb represented the old guard of medicine, physicians who believed in rigid hierarchies and traditional pathways. His acknowledgement of my success signaled a broader shift in how my unconventional journey was being perceived. But the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The Chicago Medical Association had decided to feature my story in their monthly publication, highlighting my path from hospital janitor to emergency medicine fellow as an example of determination and innovation in medical education. The interview took place in the same conference room where I'd pitched my research ideas as a medical student. The journalist, Sandra Morrison, was a healthcare reporter who had covered medicine for over 2 decades. "Dr. Chen, your story is remarkable, but I'm curious about the broader implications. What does your experience suggest about how we identify and develop medical talent?" The question forced me to think beyond my personal journey to consider systemic issues in medical education and healthcare access. "I think it suggests that potential exists in places we don't always think to look," I'd replied. "There are probably thousands of people working in healthcare support roles who have the intelligence and dedication to become excellent physicians, but they lack access to traditional pathways. Do you think your experience could be replicated? Could hospitals develop programs to identify and nurture talent among their support staff?" "Absolutely. In fact, I think hospitals have a responsibility to do exactly that. The people who clean our floors, prepare our meals, and maintain our facilities see healthcare from perspectives that physicians rarely consider. That insight could be invaluable in developing more effective, more compassionate medical practices." The interview had continued for over an hour, covering everything from healthcare policy to medical education reform. When the article was published 2 weeks later, it sparked conversations throughout Chicago's medical community about unconventional pathways to medicine and the untapped potential within hospital workforces. But the recognition that mattered most came from the patients I'd helped save. 3 months after the mass casualty event, I'd received a letter from the family of the truck driver, whose life I'd helped save that October evening. Dr. Chen, the letter read, "We will never be able to adequately thank you for saving our father's life. He's back to work now, healthy and whole, because of your skill and dedication. We've heard about your remarkable journey from janitor to doctor, and we want you to know that our father's life was saved by someone who truly understands the value of hard work and determination." The letter had brought tears to my eyes, not just because of the gratitude it expressed, but because it validated everything I'd sacrificed to reach this point. This was why I'd endured Madison's cruelty, why I'd accepted my family's dismissal, why I'd spent 3 years being invisible while building something extraordinary. I was no longer the girl who cleaned floors while dreaming of saving lives. I was the doctor who had risen above every limitation others had placed on her, who had transformed invisibility into insight, who had turned dismissal into determination. And this was only the beginning. Hayus mizabinima, bisnahel nrokosaka has mizabinibinima, bisnahel nri apaida, bisnetation, hayusaka has mizabinima apaida, bimal nrokosaka. Relatation January, offering opportunities I could barely imagine. International disaster response, cutting-edge research, leadership roles in developing emergency medicine protocols that could save thousands of lives. I was about to enter a world where my voice would matter, where my opinions would shape policy, where my experiences would benefit people I'd never met. While my family continued to struggle with their revised understanding of my potential, I was moving beyond their comprehension entirely. They saw my success as a personal vindication, but I understood it as something much larger. Proof that excellence can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that true worth isn't determined by other people's expectations, and that sometimes the greatest achievements come from those who were never expected to achieve anything at all. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in December, delivered by courier to my apartment with the kind of formal presentation that suggested significance. The envelope bore the seal of the Chicago Medical Association, and inside was an invitation that would change everything. The Chicago Medical Association cordially invites you to accept the 2024 Young Physician Excellence Award at our annual gala on January 15th. This honor recognizes exceptional achievement in medical practice, innovative approaches to patient care, and outstanding contributions to the medical community. I stared at the invitation for a long moment, processing not just the honor itself but its timing. The award ceremony would take place at the same Meridian Hotel where Madison had humiliated me just 8 months earlier. The same ballroom where she'd forced me to clean up broken glass while announcing to everyone within earshot that I was just a janitor, would now host an event celebrating my achievements as a physician. The symmetry was almost too perfect to be accidental. Dr. Santos called me later that day to personally congratulate me on the selection. "Jessica, I hope you understand what this means," she'd said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "This award isn't given lightly. You're the youngest recipient in the association's history, and the selection committee was unanimous in their choice." "I'm honored, Dr. Santos." "The committee was particularly impressed by your fellowship acceptance and your approach to emergency medicine education. Your story represents something important about resilience and excellence in healthcare." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. In less than a year, I'd gone from being invisible to being celebrated, from being dismissed by my own family to being recognized by the city's most prestigious medical organization. But the invitation also meant something else. My family would inevitably learn about the award. The Chicago Medical Association Gala was covered by local media, attended by prominent citizens, and discussed in the social circles where my parents traveled. There would be no hiding this achievement, no downplaying its significance. Sure enough, my mother called that evening. "Jessica, Mrs. Holbrook mentioned she saw something in the Tribune about a medical award. She said your name was mentioned?" The careful way she phrased the question revealed everything. She was fishing for information, hoping I'd provide details that would help her understand exactly how significant this recognition was. I've been selected for the Young Physician Excellence Award from the Chicago Medical Association. The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if the call had been dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice carried a note I'd never heard before, something between pride and panic. The Chicago Medical Association? That's very prestigious, isn't it? Yes, it is. And they chose you, after less than a year of being a doctor? The question stung because it revealed her continued inability to understand what I'd accomplished. Even when confronted with objective recognition of my achievements, she couldn't fully accept that her disappointment daughter had exceeded every expectation. They chose me because of my clinical performance, my innovative approach to emergency medicine, and my contributions to medical education, I'd replied, keeping my voice steady despite the frustration building in my chest. Of course. We're very proud of you, Jessica. Very proud. But her pride felt hollow, reactive rather than genuine. She was proud because other people were recognizing me, not because she understood or valued what I'd achieved. Her approval was always dependent on external validation, never rooted in actual understanding of my worth. The conversation continued with her asking about the ceremony details, whether there would be media coverage, who else would be attending. I could practically hear her mind racing, calculating how this development would affect the family's social standing and what it would mean for their carefully reconstructed narrative about my journey. Within hours, she'd called Madison, who then called me with barely contained frustration. Mom says you're getting some kind of major medical award? Yes. At the Meridian Hotel? Yes. Madison was quiet for a moment, and I could imagine her processing the irony. The same venue where she'd publicly humiliated me would now host my professional triumph. The poetic justice was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Jessica, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Okay. Are you doing this to make me look bad? The timing, the location, it feels deliberate. The question revealed so much about how Madison viewed the world. In her mind, my success was somehow about her. My achievements were calculated moves in some ongoing sibling rivalry. She couldn't conceive that my life had moved beyond her orbit, that my accomplishments existed independently of our family dynamics. Madison, I didn't choose the venue or the timing. The Chicago Medical Association selected me for this honor based on my medical work. It has nothing to do with you. But you have to admit, it's awkward. After what happened at the charity gala, what's awkward about it? People will remember. They'll connect the dots. They'll realize that when I said those things about you being a janitor, you were actually a doctor. Finally, we were approaching the heart of the matter. Madison wasn't concerned about my feelings or the injustice of her past behavior. She was worried about her own image, about how her cruelty would be perceived in light of my success. Madison, I didn't choose to receive this award to embarrass you. But I'm also not going to decline it to protect your reputation. I never said you should decline it. I wish you'd given us some warning, some time to prepare. Prepare for what? For people asking questions. For having to explain why we didn't know about your achievements. For looking like we were unsupportive of our own family members. The conversation revealed a fundamental truth. My family was more concerned with managing their image than with understanding their mistakes. They wanted to control the narrative around my success without acknowledging their role in creating the circumstances that made secrecy necessary. But their discomfort was about to intensify. 3 days after the award announcement, I received a call from Sandra Morrison, the healthcare journalist who had interviewed me for the Chicago Medical Association article. Dr. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I'm working on a follow-up piece about your award, and I was hoping to get some additional perspective on your journey. Of course. I've been thinking about our previous conversation, particularly your comments about identifying medical talent in non-traditional places. Your story has sparked significant discussion in the medical community about pathway diversity and educational innovation. The interview had taken place at a coffee shop near the hospital, the same kind of informal setting where I'd once studied for medical school exams while wearing my environmental services uniform. But now I was being interviewed as an expert, someone whose opinions shaped professional discourse. Dr. Chen, I'm curious about your family's reaction to your success. They must be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. How do you explain to a journalist that your family's pride is conditional, shallow, and primarily motivated by social considerations rather than genuine understanding? My family's relationship with my achievements has been complex, I'd answered carefully. Complex? How? They didn't initially support my medical school aspirations. The path I took, working as a janitor while attending medical school, wasn't something they understood or encouraged. Sandra had leaned forward, recognizing the story beneath my diplomatic language. Are you saying they were unaware of your medical school enrollment? They were unaware because they'd made it clear that pursuing medicine wasn't a path they would support, financially or emotionally. So you completed your medical degree while they believed you were working as a janitor? That's correct. The interview continued for another hour, with Sandra asking increasingly pointed questions about family dynamics, social expectations, and the cost of pursuing dreams without support systems. I'd answered honestly but carefully, aware that my words would be published and read by people who knew my family. When the article appeared 2 weeks later, it painted a more complete picture of my journey than any previous coverage. The headline read, "From Invisible to Indispensable, Dr. Jessica Chen's Path to Medical Excellence Despite Family Obstacles." The piece detailed not just my professional achievements, but the personal costs of my unconventional path. It described the isolation of pursuing medical school while family members remained unaware of my goals, the emotional toll of being dismissed as a failure while secretly excelling, and the complex dynamics that had made secrecy necessary. The article's impact was immediate and far-reaching. Within days, I was receiving messages from other healthcare workers who had similar stories, people who had overcome family opposition or social expectations to pursue medical careers. My story had become a symbol of something larger than personal achievement. It represented the potential that exists when people are willing to pursue excellence despite obstacles. But the article also forced my family to confront uncomfortable truths about their role in my journey. The piece made clear that my secrecy hadn't been motivated by deception or drama, but by necessity created by their lack of support. My father called me the day after the article's publication, his voice carrying a defensive edge I'd rarely heard. "Jessica, I read the article in the Tribune. Some of the things that were said, they don't present the family in a very positive light. What specifically concerns you, Dad?" "The implication that we were unsupportive of your education. That's not accurate. We've always valued education. You've always valued Madison's education. You told me medicine was too competitive for me and refused to help with tuition costs. That's not how I remember it." "That's exactly how it happened, Dad. You said the family business needed continuity, not risky ventures. Those were your words." The conversation had continued with him attempting to rewrite history, claiming that his opposition had been based on practical concerns rather than lack of faith in my abilities. But the damage was done. The article had preserved the truth in print, making it impossible for him to revise the past to suit his current needs. Masas. Madison's reaction was more direct. She'd shown up at my apartment unannounced 3 days after the article's publication, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Do you have any idea what this article has done to our reputation?" she'd demanded without preamble. "What reputation?" "People are talking, Jessica. At the country club, at business events, at social gatherings. Everyone's asking why we didn't support your medical school dreams, why we didn't know about your achievements. And what are you telling them?" "I'm telling them it's complicated, but no one believes that. They think we're terrible people who crushed our own family members' dreams." "Aren't you?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. For the first time in our relationship, I was directly confronting Madison's behavior instead of absorbing it silently. "That's not fair, Jessica. We didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You were comfortable with your narrative about my limitations because it made you feel superior. When I tried to discuss my goals, you dismissed them. When I achieved academic success, you minimized it. You created an environment where hiding my achievements was the only way to protect them. Madison had stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between recognition and resentment. For the first time, she was being forced to confront the possibility that her treatment of me hadn't been justified by my failures, but had been motivated by her own insecurities. "What do you want from me, Jessica? An apology? Acknowledging that I was wrong?" "I don't want anything from you, Madison. That's what you don't understand. Your approval or apology won't change what happened, and I don't need them to move forward." "So what? You're just going to let people think we're terrible?" "I'm going to let people think whatever they want based on the information available to them. If they conclude you were unsupportive, that's because you were unsupportive. If they think you were dismissive, that's because you were dismissive." The conversation had ended with Madison leaving in frustration, unable to extract from me the kind of public defense or family loyalty that might have mitigated the damage to her image. She wanted me to help her manage the consequences of her behavior without accepting responsibility for that behavior. But the most significant reckoning was yet to come. The award ceremony was still 3 weeks away, and I knew that my family would attend. They couldn't afford to be absent from such a public recognition of my achievements, but their presence would force them to confront the full magnitude of what they'd missed and dismissed. As I prepared for the ceremony, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The girl who had once cleaned the floors of the Meridian Hotel would return as the guest of honor, celebrated for achievements that her own family had considered impossible. The symmetry was perfect, but the satisfaction was complex, tinged with sadness for relationships that had been damaged by limitations others had placed on my potential. The reckoning was coming, and it would be public, undeniable, and final. My family would have to choose between continuing their defensive revisionism or accepting the truth about their role in my journey. Either way, I would move forward with or without their understanding, secure in the knowledge that my worth wasn't dependent on their recognition. The girl they'd dismissed was about to be honored by the entire Chicago medical community, and there would be no hiding from that reality. The morning of January 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of Chicago winter day where the sky looks like polished steel and the air cuts through you with crystalline precision. I stood at my apartment window, watching the city wake up below, and thought about how different this day would be from the last time I'd walked into the Meridian Hotel. 8 months ago, I'd entered that building as Madison's reluctant +1, wearing a thrift store dress and carrying the weight of family disappointment. Tonight, I would return as Dr. Jessica Chen, recipient of the Chicago Medical Association's Young Physician Excellence Award, wearing confidence earned through years of sacrifice and determination. The invitation had specified formal attire, so I'd chosen a navy blue evening gown that I'd purchased specifically for the occasion. It was the first piece of clothing I'd ever bought that cost more than a week's groceries, but it felt appropriate. This wasn't just an awards ceremony. It was a transformation made visible, a public declaration that the invisible girl had become impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed with messages throughout the morning. Dr. Harrison had sent congratulations, along with news that 2 major medical journals wanted to feature articles about my unconventional path to medicine. Dr. Santos had forwarded an email from the American College of Emergency Physicians, asking if I'd be interested in speaking at their national conference about innovative approaches to medical education. But the message that meant the most came from Maria Gonzalez, my former supervisor in environmental services. "Misha, we're all watching tonight. You make us proud every day, but tonight the whole world gets to see what we always knew. You were never just cleaning floors. You were preparing to save lives." The ceremony wasn't scheduled to begin until 7 o'clock, but I arrived at the hospital early for a brief meeting with Dr. Reeves. She'd requested a few minutes to discuss my fellowship timeline and some research opportunities that had emerged from the publicity surrounding my award. "Jessica," she'd said as I entered her office, "I hope you're prepared for what tonight represents. This isn't just recognition of your achievements. It's a platform for everything you'll accomplish in the future." I understand. Do you? Because what you've done, succeeding in medical school while working full-time, excelling in your residency, earning this award in less than a year, it's going to inspire other people to pursue paths they never thought possible. You're going to become a symbol whether you want to or not. Her words carried weight because they acknowledged something I'd been struggling to accept. My story had grown beyond my personal experience to represent broader possibilities in medical education and professional development. People weren't just celebrating my individual success. They were celebrating proof that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. The hospital board has authorized me to offer you a research position, Dr. Reeves continued. We want to develop a program that identifies and supports potential medical students among our support staff. We're calling it the Chen Initiative. The name stopped me cold. Having a program named after me felt surreal, like confirmation that my journey had transcended personal achievement to become institutional change. The girl who had once worried about being discovered as a medical student was now having programs named in her honor. Dr. Reeves, I'm honored, but you're worried about the responsibility? Don't be. You've already proven that unconventional approaches to medical education can work. Now we want to systematize that success, create pathways for other people who have the potential but lack traditional access. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering research protocols, funding mechanisms, and implementation timelines. By the time I left her office, I understood that tonight's award ceremony would mark not just the culmination of my personal journey, but the beginning of something larger. I spent the afternoon at home, preparing mentally for an evening that would bring together all the threads of my story. My family would be there. My parents and Madison had confirmed their attendance, though their motivations remained unclear. Hospital colleagues would be present, representing the professional community that had embraced my unconventional background. And journalists would be covering the event, ensuring that whatever happened would become part of the public record. At 5:30, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. Jessica, I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to call before tonight to say something. Her voice carried a tone I'd rarely heard, tentative, almost vulnerable. What is it, Mom? I've been thinking a lot about the article in the Tribune, about some of the things that were said about our family's support for your education. I waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. I want you to know that your father and we've realized we made mistakes. We didn't understand what you were trying to accomplish, and we didn't provide the support you needed. The admission was partial, qualified, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from her before. I appreciate you saying that, Mom. Tonight is going to be difficult for us. Not because we're not proud of you. We are incredibly proud. But because we know that people will be looking at us and wondering how we could have been so blind to your potential. Mom, you don't need to worry about what other people think. But I do worry. Because they're right to wonder. We were your parents, and we should have seen what you were capable of. We should have supported your dreams instead of dismissing them. The conversation was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive, and while it didn't erase years of disappointment and dismissal, it represented a recognition of reality that had been long overdue. Jessica, I have one request for tonight. What's that? When you give your acceptance speech, I hope you'll remember that families can learn and grow, just like individuals. We may not have been the parents you needed then, but we're trying to be better now. I'd promised to consider her words, though I'd already drafted my speech and had no intention of using it to rehabilitate my family's image. Tonight was about celebrating achievement earned through perseverance despite obstacles, not minimizing those obstacles to protect people's feelings. At 6 o'clock, I put on my evening gown and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was someone I barely recognized, not because of the formal attire or professional makeup, but because of the confidence in her eyes. This was Dr. Jessica Chen, Emergency Medicine Fellow, award recipient, symbol of possibility. She looked like someone who belonged in rooms full of accomplished people, someone whose opinions mattered, someone who had earned her place through merit rather than inheritance. The Meridian Hotel looked exactly as I remembered it from 8 months earlier, but my perspective had changed completely. As I walked through the same entrance where I'd once arrived as Madison's reluctant guest, I was greeted by hotel staff who recognized me from newspaper photos and medical association publicity materials. Dr. Chen, congratulations on your award, the concierge had said with genuine warmth. It's an honor to have you celebrating here tonight. The ballroom was already filled with Chicago's medical elite when I arrived. The same crystal chandeliers that had illuminated my humiliation now cast light on my triumph. The same tables where I'd sat silently while Madison performed her cruelty were now occupied by colleagues who respected my expertise and valued my contributions. Dr. Santos approached me within minutes of my arrival, accompanied by several board members I recognized but had never met formally. "Jessica, I'd like you to meet Dr. Robert Martinez, President of the Chicago Medical Association, and Dr. Linda Foster, Chair of our Awards Committee." The introductions continued for several minutes, each person sharing comments about my achievements and expressing admiration for my unconventional path to medicine. What struck me most was how naturally they treated me as an equal, how seamlessly I fit into conversations about medical policy, research initiatives, and professional development. This was the world Madison had assumed was forever beyond my reach, the level of society she'd believed I could never access. But I hadn't gained entry through inherited connections or family wealth. I'd earned my place through competence, determination, and excellence. At 7:15, I noticed my family's arrival. My parents entered first, dressed in formal attire that suggested they understood the significance of the occasion. They moved with the careful precision of people navigating unfamiliar social territory, clearly aware that their presence would be scrutinized. Madison followed moments later, wearing a stunning red gown that probably cost more than my first year's medical school tuition. But for the first time in our lives, her appearance didn't dwarf mine. Tonight, she was the sister of the guest of honor, rather than the center of attention, and the role reversal was clearly uncomfortable for her. They found seats at a table near the back of the ballroom, as far from the spotlight as possible, while still maintaining their obligation to attend. I watched them settle in, noting their body language, proud but defensive, supportive but self-conscious. The program began with remarks from Dr. Martinez about the association's commitment to recognizing excellence in medicine. He spoke about the importance of innovation, dedication, and service to the community, values that the evening's honorees exemplified. This year's Young Physician Excellence Award recipient represents something extraordinary in medical achievement, he announced as my introduction began. Dr. Jessica Chen completed her medical education while working full-time as a hospital environmental services employee, demonstrating that excellence can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but I was focused on my family's table. My parents were clapping politely, their expressions carefully neutral. Madison's smile looked forced, as if she were performing approval rather than feeling it. Dr. Chen's story challenges conventional assumptions about medical education and professional development, Dr. Martinez continued. She has shown that determination, intelligence, and hard work can overcome any obstacle, including lack of traditional support systems. That last phrase, lack of traditional support systems, was diplomatic language for family opposition, and I saw Madison's smile falter slightly as the implication registered. When my name was called, I rose and walked to the podium with steady steps. The same stage where I'd once watched Madison network aggressively was now mine. The same audience that had once witnessed my humiliation was now celebrating my success. I looked out at the assembled crowd, hundreds of Chicago's most accomplished physicians, researchers, and medical administrators, and felt a profound sense of belonging. These were my peers now, my professional community, the people who understood and valued what I'd accomplished. "Thank you for this incredible honor," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. 8 months ago, I stood in this very room as someone most of you would have considered invisible. I was wearing a simple black dress instead of a formal gown, and I was known to everyone here as simply Jessica, a member of the environmental services staff. I could see people in the audience exchanging glances, some remembering me from that earlier event, others hearing this detail for the first time. That night, someone very close to me announced to this room that I was just a janitor, as if that fact diminished my worth as a human being. What she didn't know, what none of you knew, was that the woman cleaning your tables was also studying emergency medicine, preparing for a career dedicated to saving lives. The ballroom had grown completely silent, everyone focused on the story unfolding before them. I share this not to embarrass anyone or settle old scores, but to illustrate an important truth. Potential exists everywhere, often in people and places we don't think to value. The environmental services employee might be a future doctor. The cafeteria worker might be a brilliant researcher. The security guard might have insights that could revolutionize patient care. I paused, making eye contact with various sections of the audience, including the table where my family sat frozen in uncomfortable recognition. Medical excellence isn't determined by background, connections, or family support. It's determined by dedication, intelligence, and commitment to serving others. Some of us are fortunate enough to receive encouragement and resources from the beginning. Others have to create their own opportunities and find their own paths. The applause began spontaneously, growing in intensity as people throughout the ballroom rose to their feet. I could see Dr. Santos wiping tears from her eyes, Dr. Harrison nodding with obvious pride, and hospital staff members beaming as if my success reflected their own validation. This award represents more than individual achievement, I continued as the applause subsided. It represents proof that our medical community can recognize and nurture excellence regardless of its origins. It proves that determination can overcome dismissal, that competence can triumph over prejudice, that excellence will ultimately be recognized even when it emerges from unexpected places. I concluded my speech by announcing the Chen Initiative, the program that would identify and support potential medical students among hospital support staff. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sustained applause, standing ovation, and multiple requests from other hospitals asking how they could implement similar programs. As I returned to my seat, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from invisible janitor to celebrated physician was complete, marked not by revenge or vindication, but by recognition of possibilities that had always existed but had finally been allowed to flourish. The reception following the ceremony was a whirlwind of congratulations, networking opportunities, and interview requests. I found myself surrounded by colleagues, administrators, and journalists, all wanting to discuss my story, my research plans, and my vision for the future of medical education. But the conversation that mattered most happened near the end of the evening. My parents had approached hesitantly, clearly uncertain about how to navigate this new dynamic, where their daughter was the center of attention and respect. "Jessica," my father said quietly, "your speech was remarkable. We're very proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Dad. We also realize that we have a lot to make up for. We failed to see your potential when it mattered most, and we're sorry for that." The apology was simple, direct, and long overdue. It didn't erase years of disappointment and dismissal, but it acknowledged reality in a way they'd never done before. "I appreciate that, Dad. I really do." My mother stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Jessica, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that we're going to do better. We're going to support you going forward, even if we can't change the past." Madison had remained silent during this exchange, but as our parents moved away, she finally approached me. "Jessica, I owe you an apology too, a big one." "Madison, no, let me say this. I was cruel to you, especially that night 8 months ago. I was wrong about your limitations, wrong about your potential, wrong about everything. You've accomplished something extraordinary, and you did it despite my attempts to tear you down." Her apology was more complete than I'd expected, more honest about her motivations and actions. It wouldn't repair our relationship overnight, but it was a foundation for something better than what we'd had. "Thank you for saying that, Madison. I appreciate it. I also want you to know that I'm going to tell people the truth about what happened, about how wrong I was, about how remarkable your achievements are. I won't let anyone minimize what you've done to protect my reputation." The conversation ended with an awkward but genuine hug, the first physical affection we'd shared in years. As the evening wound down, I stood once again at the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, but everything had changed. 8 months ago, I'd been planning my escape from a family that didn't value me. Tonight, I was surrounded by a professional community that recognized my worth, supported my goals, and celebrated my achievements. The girl who'd once cleaned these floors had become the doctor who commanded respect in these rooms. The woman who'd been dismissed as just a janitor was now Dr. Jessica Chen, fellow in emergency medicine, recipient of the Young Physician Excellence Award, and architect of programs that would help other invisible people find their own paths to recognition. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Tomorrow I would return to the hospital, where I'd once mopped floors, but I'd return as someone who belonged there, whose voice mattered, whose vision could shape the future of medicine. Some stories end with revenge, others conclude with reconciliation. Mine ended with recognition, not just of my achievements, but of the truth that excellence can emerge from anywhere, flourish under any circumstances, and ultimately triumph over every attempt to diminish it. The invisible girl had become impossible to ignore, and that was the greatest victory of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.